All right, so when we left off, we were talking about different types of economies and the people that have studied them, including Adam Smith and Karl Marx. That's something you could have included in the bell ringer, for instance. And then hopefully you got through the USSR and Reagan media activity. If not, you have some more time after the notes to do that. And that, of course, make sure that you submit the file that came along with that, where you type in 10 facts and 5 interpretations about each of the videos that are a part of that assignment. And so, with the notes, Adam Smith and Karl Marx, of course, aren't the only two economists that are more well known because, as we indicated with the different types of economies or economic systems, there's free market at one end, which Adam Smith would support, and at the other end, a command oriented economy, which Karl Marx would support during the socialist stage. But there's also a middle ground, too. And one of the economists that came prominent during the Great Depression was John Maynard Keynes. And unfortunately, he didn't come up with these ideas until after the Great Depression had already started. But basically, he believed that there is kind of a middle ground, that the government should do something when times get bad. And the government can basically do that through two major ways. One of them would be to lower interest rates, and you hear that talked a lot about in the news during an economic recession, lowering interest rates. Because if interest rates are low, then people will borrow money to buy things or to build things. So he thought that was important to do. And the second one is that the government should spend to invest in the economy, especially things like infrastructure. And that was kind of revolutionary because before the Great Depression, the common thought was, well, just do nothing and wait it out. Another thing that people often responded to in the past was just save money. But if everyone just saves money, the government balances its budget, people pinch their pennies and save money, then no one is buying anything. And so recessions end up lasting longer. So he thought it was important to lower interest rates and for the government to spend in order to get us out of things like the Great Depression. So the point is that we don't have to remain the same way forever. We can have different types of transitions in the economy. In countries, modern economies have what we called mixed economies. So today, most countries in the world, all of them, except for a few, aren't really at the extreme ends of the spectrum, but somewhere in between. So countries can actually move from one end to the other. They can be more command oriented or more free, and that can change over time. Just to give you an example, China, over the last 40 or 50 years, has been becoming more free. Now, of course, they're still an authoritarian country, and the government is obviously still in charge of most of the decisions, but they have been allowing more and more investment and private ownership. People can buy their own homes and cars and start businesses. Foreign investment is allowed. The world's biggest McDonald's, for instance, is in Beijing. So that is different than what would happen, for instance, in the 60s and 70s. So it is possible for countries to change where they are. And whenever they do become freer and the government turns over control, that is known as privatization. And privatization happens in the United States too. The airline industry used to be heavily regulated by the government, and eventually it loosened those controls, which led to a lot more competition and better prices. So that is also another example of privatization, especially when the government owns something and turns it over to private businesses. And of course, modern China, just to focus on them a little bit more, they started transitioning away from a command-oriented economy in 1978. Before that, they used to be like the Soviet Union, where all the decisions were made in one place. And they had strict communist control. However, after 1978, they decided not to have just one person with all the power, and they decided to allow more economic decisions to be made by others. That has resulted in the Chinese economy more than quadrupling, and by 2018 stood as the second largest economy in the world after the United States. You still see some industries controlled by the government, but compared to the past, a lot more individual, independent businesses exist. Businesses that you can buy stock in, businesses that buy and sell property all over the world. Per capita wise, the country is still not as well off as they'd like to be, but they have lifted tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions, out of poverty. The problem is, of course, is that they still have some negative effects of both a free and a command-oriented economy. They have lots of freedom when it comes to, for instance, allowing pollution. So they have a considerable amount of that. And they still have lots of bureaucracy, paperwork, and regulations to go through. So they have some of the negative effects of both a free and a command-oriented economy at the same time. And of course, as time goes by and their wages go up, they also have to deal with the same thing that we do, outsourcing. So factories shut down and get moved to other places like Indonesia or Vietnam. They obviously aren't going to have a very pleased workforce. So China is attempting to basically try to make as many consumer goods as they can to help please their people, so that way they have a higher standard of living and don't pay attention to the fact that there are some economic shifts and troubles that are going to happen. And the other example that I'll give to you would be North Korea. This is a country that hasn't really changed that much. It's probably today's most controlled economy. It's incredibly isolated. Really, its only trading partner is China. And that's only because they share a border and China would like to have some influence over them. There's major underinvestment. Obviously, being isolated, no one wants to invest in their country, but also internally. There is investment in their capital city, so that way their leadership can look good. But outside of that, though, there is a major lack of infrastructure and upkeep, basic things like medical supplies. There are shortages of spare parts for machinery. And they have suffered through extreme shortages of food. Most of their efforts get put into their military. But of course, that means they can't put as much into the butter part of the economy. Earlier, we talked about guns versus butter. Their economy is definitely guns focused, so they put most of their efforts into the military, leaving the people suffering. That has resulted in a huge black market, people desperate to get even basic things like Band-Aids and food. But there is no room for protest, as anyone that criticizes the leadership, including the leader's family members, can be executed. So Thursday we'll talk about the American economy and a little bit how it's evolved over time. That relates, of course, to the Reagan video that was in today's assignment. And then Friday we'll talk about some other types of statistics and terms that economists use in their field of science. So for the remainder of the period, you can finish up that video activity if you haven't already, or the reading, for instance, or you can work ahead.